What exactly are the Gospels? They're stories about Jesus, sure, but are they just stories, like legends? I grew up in Middle Tennessee and heard legends about the Bell Witch. Are the Gospels just exaggerations from over-creative Christians? Are the Gospels fabrications from early Christian communities who created traditions about Jesus to fit their needs? Or are the Gospels supposed to be reliable accounts of Jesus' life and teaching? Well, over the last century plus, the pendulum has swung from one side to the other on what exactly are the Gospels. Now, if you grew up in church, this issue of literary genre might not seem like that big of a deal, but here's the thing. What we believe about the genre of the Gospels seriously affects what we believe about how the evangelists portrayed Jesus and how ancient audiences were expected to understand the Gospels. Welcome to Faith in the Folds, a podcast for Ministry of Biblical Studies and Christian Living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. Today, I'm going to walk us through a little bit about the Gospels genre. Now, before we dive into all of this, I'll mention that I'm drawing from a short article by Richard Burridge entitled Gospel Genre. This article is from the second edition of the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels, published by InterVarsity Press. Now, the definitive work on this topic is also a book published from Richard Burridge, written in 1992. He released an updated version in 2004, and then in 2018, a 25th anniversary edition was released in which Burridge includes extra material responding to the last 2 decades of interaction with his work. By the way, if you're doing the math and you realize that 1992 to 2018 is actually 26 years, that's just a peculiarity of publishing. The book was technically completed by 2017, but it always takes a few months to make sure everything is finalized before the manuscript actually goes to print. Okay, without any further ado, let's get into it. Ancient and medieval believers often read Scripture in a variety of ways that we describe today as literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical, which focuses on the communication of spiritual or heavenly realities. Now, most of the prominent voices in the Reformation abandoned this multi-tiered approach and favored the literal or historical interpretation of Scripture. So on this reading, then, the Gospels were understood to be biographies of some type. Now, this trend continued, reading the Gospels as biographies, until around 1863, when French scholar Ernest Renan published his controversial but highly influential book, creatively titled Life of Jesus, in which he attempted to write a biography of Jesus while treating Jesus like one would any other historical figure. Although many of Renan's ideas are discounted today, his work set the tone for critical research on Jesus for the next 40 years. Now, during his time, biographies of historical persons tended to include discussions of the subject's upbringing, the context of major events during the subject's life, as well as the subject's psychological development. Now, these newer biographies of Jesus from the latter half of the 19th century were consciously or unconsciously modeled on secular biographies. And so as additional biographies of Jesus came available, the shorter and less detailed Gospels began to look like something else by comparison, and thus the opinion of the Gospels genre slowly began to change. By the early 20th century, the consensus position on the Gospels genre was that they were unique among ancient literature, and scholars would sometimes use a Latin phrase, sui generis, meaning of a unique type, to describe the Gospels genre. The likes of Rudolf Bultmann and Carl Ludwig Schmidt affirmed this position. These scholars, among others, argued that the Gospels were more akin to collections of folklore legends rather than historical accounts of Jesus' life and teaching. Consequently, particularly German scholarship on the Gospels, which predominated scholarship of the Gospels for much of the first half of the 20th century, German scholarship viewed the evangelists, or at least their intentions, as dispensable, and the structure and arrangement of their gospel accounts were irrelevant. Instead of examining the entire Gospel of Mark, for example, this group of scholars who came to be known as form critics, given their focus on pre-literary oral traditions known as forms, they studied the individual units or narratives of the Gospels in order to discern what was believed to be the earliest version of a saying from or tradition about Jesus. So perhaps a helpful way to think about this process is like archaeology with literature. The assumption was that there's a core story or saying from Jesus, which gets passed around like any type of oral tradition. As this tradition is transmitted through time, it begins to accrue additional layers, such as details of the story, connections with the Old Testament, and so on. Form criticism supposedly enabled scholars to kind of peer through these layers and recover either the original or most likely original saying from Jesus or story about him. Now, today, the general consensus of research on the Gospels is that form criticism may have had some merit or use, but as an approach for studying the Gospels, it has largely been abandoned. As I've already mentioned, within form criticism was the idea that the evangelists were mainly compilers of traditions, but played only a minimal role in the final shaping of the Gospels. Following on the heels of form criticism, then, other scholars began to take more seriously the evangelist's role in arranging material. Look at it like this. If Mark wrote his gospel first, a natural question arises: why did Matthew arrange his gospel and include other material somewhat differently than Mark? That is, what special emphasis does Matthew give to certain ideas or themes? Or how is Luke different from Matthew? And what does that show us about their different emphases? So the renewed focus on the evangelist's role as editors and arrangers gave rise to an approach for studying the Gospels called redaction criticism, where the word redaction refers to the evangelist's editorial processes. Redaction critics also asked about the intended audiences of the Gospels. Now, eventually, a theory was devised that the individual evangelists compiled their accounts not for all believers everywhere, but for particular groups or communities which the evangelists represented. So there was believed to be a Markan community, a Matthean community, a Lucan community, and so on. These scholars argued that the individual gospel accounts were compiled as they were in order to address the needs of that particular evangelist's community. For example, when Jesus mentions persecution or some other issue, many redaction critics believed the early church had not so much remembered a tradition about Jesus addressing that issue, as much as the church had creatively placed their own issues back into the life and teaching of Jesus. Now, for what it's worth, I don't agree with that. I'm just simply telling you how they operated. Now, a consequence of this focus on the evangelist as a redactor or shaper of material was new interest in the evangelist as author/theologian. In other words, the author's intention in presenting his material in the way that he did now began to rise from the background of the gospel study to the foreground. This literary critical approach to the Gospels rose to prominence in the 1970s, and several New Testament scholars wrote seminal works on the evangelist's use of literary devices such as plot, characterization, irony, and others. Now, as Richard Burridge points out, if these scholars were raising issues about authorial intent, then it was inevitable that the Guild would revisit the issue of the Gospels genre, and that's precisely what happened when Graham Stanton in 1974 and Charles Talbert in 1977 became among the first to revisit the biographical nature of the Gospels over 100 years after Renan's Life of Jesus. Now, although Stanton and Talbert's arguments did not win the day back in the 70s, they paved the way for what would happen a decade and a half later. In 1992, Richard Burridge authored the book What Are the Gospels? A Comparison with Greco-Roman Biography, a work that would eventually turn the tide back in favor of identifying the Gospels as types of ancient Greco-Roman biography. What made Burridge's work so convincing was his robust description and discussion of genre theory. I think he's absolutely right when he says this, quote, "Genre is a key convention guiding both the composition and the interpretation of writings. Genre forms a contract or agreement, often unspoken or unwritten or even unconscious, between an author and a reader, by which the author composes according to a set of expectations, and the reader interprets the work following the same conventions, which provide an initial idea of what to expect." Different genres of literature have different ranges of features that, when presented together, exhibit something of a family resemblance among themselves. When we approach a text where we have relatively little certain knowledge about the original audience, or maybe the author or the situation of the writing, we can benefit greatly by comparing the Gospels with other works of ancient literature to discern where the Gospels fit best. In the book by Burridge I mentioned just a moment ago, he performed precisely this kind of comparison with ancient works known as lives. Now, the Greek word bios and the Latin word vita, both accurately translated life, both these words were used to describe works that focused on the life and career of a particular person who lived in real time and space. And for what it's worth, the word biographia doesn't appear until the 9th century. So, what is a bios, and how do we interpret such a work? Well, with regard to the structure of these works, a typical bios, or life of a person, ran somewhere between 10,000 and 25,000 words long, and did not always cover the subject's entire life and death. The genre bios was somewhat flexible, as almost all literary genres are, but works of this genre generally included 12 features that appeared consistently throughout the lives that Burridge examined, which ranged from 430 BC to AD 250. These are: 1. Subject named at the beginning or after the prologue. 2. The work can have either a chronological or topical arrangement. 3. The work's single focus is on the subject, with the main character serving as a subject of the verb more than any other character. 4. They're about a medium-length narrative of 10,000 to 25,000 words. 5. Sometimes the work is framed by birth and death and filled in with stories, speeches, and actions of the main subject. 6. Characterization is presented primarily through the subject's own words and deeds rather than having the narrator tell the audience what the subject was like. 7. Authors consulted and used a wide variety of oral and written sources, generally displaying greater freedom than historiography in what they could include. Now, I'll pause there just for a moment and draw our attention to Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, in which Luke himself refers to how he consulted with eyewitnesses. 8. Historical setting in real time and place. 9. Included topics of ancestry, birth, boyhood, education, great deeds, virtues, and death. 10. The ranges of the styles of the biographies range from more popular to formal or more serious and light tone. And 11. The subject is generally cast in a positive light. 12. The motivation is either didactic, apologetic, or preservation of memory. And all 12 of these are drawn from Burridge's work on biographies from the time range that I mentioned earlier. The Gospels obviously highlight Jesus' deeds and teachings, but demonstrating this statistically reinforces the point. Burridge found that Jesus himself is the subject of 1/4 of the verbs in the Gospel of Mark, and an additional 1/5 of all verbs are spoken by him in his parables and teachings. This range is comparable to what Burridge found for the subjects of other biographies. Another striking similarity between the Gospels and other Greco-Roman biographies is the lengthy presentation of Jesus' last week. The events of the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry, perhaps more than any other concentrated time of Jesus' life, most neatly captures who Jesus is and what he came to do. Naturally, then, the earliest audiences could expect the evangelists to spend a significant portion of their accounts relaying the events of Jesus' last week. Burridge says this, quote, "The concentration of 15 to 20% devoted to the last week of Jesus' life, his death and resurrection, which looked peculiar to Bultmann and the form critics, reflects the similar amount of space given to the subject's death and subsequent events in biographical works by Plutarch, Tacitus, Nepos, and Philostratus." End quote. Now, if you aren't familiar with these last 4 individuals, they also wrote biographies of other persons in the time frame of biographies which Burridge compared with the canonical Gospels. The current consensus in New Testament scholarship is that the Gospels are types of Greco-Roman biography, and I think this is the right designation. So if we have correctly identified the genre of the Gospels as biographies, that tells us something about how we should interpret the Gospels. Basically, and I mean very, very basically, because the evangelist chose to write within the generic constraints of biography, they intend to tell us about real people doing real things in real time and space. Even though there's clear evidence of plot, characterization and irony in the Gospels, the presence of these features does not automatically equate the Gospels with novels or epic poetry, for example. One New Testament scholar, Dennis MacDonald, has actually argued that the Gospel of Mark is really a retelling of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey due to the presence of certain parallels in the characterization of Jesus and Homeric heroes. Another scholar, Michael Vines, has compared the Gospel of Mark in particular with Greco-Roman and Jewish novels. And Vines concluded that Mark adapted the Jewish novel form and composed a type of novel about Jesus that depicted him overcoming oppressive forces. Now, however interesting it might be to compare Jesus with Homeric heroes or to compare the Gospels with ancient novels, MacDonald's and Vine's theses have not made much of a dent in New Testament scholarship, and I believe that's because the biographical genre of the Gospels is so overwhelmingly apparent. So as I was saying a moment ago, since the Gospels are biographies, this affects how we interpret them. We ought to approach the Gospels, therefore, with certain expectations about the subject, Jesus, rather than seeing them as exercises in creatively generating traditions about Jesus in order to answer certain churches or Christian communities' issues, as the form and redaction critics believed. The early church accepted the Gospels associated with the apostles, Matthew and John, and associates of the apostles, Mark and Luke. The way many New Testament scholars talk about this phenomenon of multiple gospel accounts is the, quote, fourfold gospel, end quote. That is, the four gospel accounts which bear witness to the one gospel of Jesus Christ. It is probable, though technically uncertain, that the Gospel of Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke adopted and adapted Mark's structure for their own specific presentations of Jesus. By the way, adjusting chronology or differences in details are absolutely normal for ancient biographies about the same person. Mike Lacona has been on the podcast before, and he's got a great book on this, which I'll refer to in the description below. Now, probably sometime later, after Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote theirs, John added his account, giving the early church these four distinct presentations of Jesus. Why these four? Why do we have these four? Well, this process didn't happen in a smoke-filled backroom deal like some try to present this. The process of accepting what would become the four canonical Gospels was a gradual process, but how could it be anything but a gradual process when, in a time without rapid transnational communication, it simply takes time for works like these to be published, copied, and shared from one location to the next? But within a relatively short time, the four canonical Gospels gained virtually universal acceptance among Christians. Now, I say virtually universal acceptance because we know of at least one famous, infamous? Sorry, if I keep going, I'm going to start doing the bit from Three Amigos. From one infamous Christian-turned-heretic who favored only one gospel against the others, Marcion of Sinope, who died around AD 160. Now, he accepted only an edited version of the Gospel of Luke and rejected the other three Gospels. But the fact that these four Gospels are the ones that he and others were discussing and using is a fairly good indicator that these were the most prominent accounts. Now, it's true that some other opponents of Christianity attacked the concept of a fourfold gospel and tried to point to supposed discrepancies within the canonical Gospels in order to discredit early Christians. Celsus, who wrote near the end of the 2nd century AD, was a Greek philosopher who wrote several treatises against Jews and Christians, specifically criticizing the multiplicity of gospel accounts. And we know about his work only due to extensive quotations from the work of Origen of Alexandria in AD 248, who responded with several volumes of refutations. Ancient opponents are not the only ones who have criticized the fourfold gospel, for even some Muslims today point to the differences in the gospels as a weakness. Now, despite these occasional criticisms, I really like how Richard Burridge puts it. He says, quote, "The plurality of the Gospel's witness was both a problem for the Church Fathers and a gift to opponents such as Celsus, Porphyry, and Julian, and in continuing debate with, for instance, Muslims today. This could have easily been solved by choosing one Gospel as the authorized biography, as Marcion did with Luke, or combining the four Gospels into a mixed narrative, as in Tatian's Dia Tessarum. The fact that the early church chose to keep four separate accounts, despite the problem of plurality and possible conflict, demonstrates the recognition that these works were coherent accounts of Jesus, written by four authors for the whole church. The earliest Christians who knew about the gospel differences were not really bothered by the differences in the accounts, although they did occasionally discuss the differences. And I believe that part of the Part of why they were not troubled by these differences because they knew they were reading biographies, lives of Jesus, occasionally referred to as the memoirs of the apostles, but lives of Jesus that operated according to a set of flexible yet distinct rules. So, when all is said and done, treating the Gospels as biographies enables us to read these accounts the way they were intended to be read. And they intend to teach us something about the real life and work of Jesus of Nazareth. And that, my friends, is when we can begin to do some very important work towards understanding Jesus as a real person in history. Reading the Gospels as biographies means it is entirely appropriate and, I think, necessary to ask questions about historicity, or in other words, did this actually happen? For now, I'll leave you with perhaps the most important historical question we can ask about Jesus. What best explains the accounts of his resurrection?